ფესტივალი მიუახლოვდა დასასრულს და ხვალ უკვე გვექნება ბოლო საღამო. მე-7 დღეს ხსნით ძალიან საინტერესო ამ სფეროსთვის და ჩვენი ფესტივალისთვის მნიშვნელოვანი დისკუსიით, რომლის იდეაც უნდა ვთქვა, რომ ეკუთვნის ხათუნა ცხადაძეს ჯერ კიდევ შარშან ვილაპარაკეთ ჩვენ ამაზე და წელს მოგვეცა შესაძლებლობა გვყავს ისეთი სტუმარი, რომელიც ამ თემას დარწმუნებული ვარ ძალიან საინტერესოდ გაშლის, ჯეკლინ Ben-Zekry, ამერიკელი მონაწილე ჩვენი პროგრამის მოდერაციას ამ შეხვედრას გაუწევს ხათუნა ცხადაძე, თარგმნელი და კიდევ ერთი მონაწილე იქნება თინა მამულაშვილი, გამომცემელი საქართველოდან. დავუთმობ უკვე მათ სალაპარაკო არეალს, ასე ვთქვათ. დიდი მადლობა მობრძანებისთვის. სინქრონული თარგმანი გვაქვს და ყველას გთხოვთ, რომ თუ გჭირდებათ თარგმანის მოსმენა, აიღოთ ყურსასმენები და ჩართოთ პირველ არხზე. მადლობა.
ისმის ხო? Hello. I hope it works. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Nuka. And I'm really thrilled and honored to host this evening today, to moderate it, and to have Jacquelyn Ben-Zekry as our guest. We call her Jackie, so I'll call her Jackie. And Tina Mamulashvili. I think most of our guests know Tina. She's a publisher. And, well, I will just shortly present Jackie because she has really an extensive experience of editing books. And she's a writer herself, too. So, and she works with debuting authors, emerging authors, with some very well-established authors, too. And it will be very, very interesting, I think, to hear about her experience. So Jacquelyn specializes in sci-fi, thriller, horror, crime fiction, but she has a very interesting experience in non-fiction too, which is another interesting field for Georgians, I think. And I've read that you have teaching experience too, so I wanted to ask you about that, the two maybe later. And, well, Jacquelyn worked as a head of international marketing at Amazon Publishing, and as acquisitions editor at Thomas & Marker. She, as I know, now works mostly as a freelancer editor. So, my first question, I don't know, I organized, I prepared some questions. Then the audience obviously is free to ask, or we can have maybe the questions as answers at the end. Yeah, maybe it's better. But if you have something, you can intervene in the middle too. So I wanted to ask Jackie, first of all, something about just the general characteristics of main features of this professional. I mean, if you can, how would you define this job? I mean, editor, because I imagine editor as a figure. First of all, is a good reader. Italo Calvino would say a slow reader. He told that about translators, actually, but I really imagine that fits very well editor's profession too. And if there is any expectation or definition we can somehow have about the editors, about this profession, just generally.
Thank you. I would say there are a couple of different types of editors out there, and it's probably important for us to sort of be on the same page about what that means. So there are acquisitions editors. Those are the people who work at publishing houses who decide what to buy and what to translate or what should go out into the public, which I was one of those for quite a while. There are also copy editors. Those are people who know things like how to spell, how to make things flow properly. And then there are developmental editors, which is what I currently do. And those are people who help to structure the novel in a way where it has the correct flow. It's the one who tries to help make sure your characters make sense. These are the people who do some fact-checking for you. They are oftentimes the people who find a manuscript and say, you need to cut half of this out because nobody's going to want to read something this long and this boring. So I would say the major attribute of a developmental editor is just sort of being a critical person, just the kind of person who sees patterns, recognizes why some things work and why some things don't, and then can spend time saying, this just simply isn't working for you, and here's how we can work together to make it better. That is the primary job that I do.
I was thinking about the background too. I mean, both professional and academic background too of this person, of editor. Are there any professional formal education courses or some course? I'm sure there are, at least in the States. And what is your background, for example? And then I wanted to ask Tina also after you. Yeah, what's your experience? Who are the people you assign the reading of the drafts which are submitted to the publishing house? So yeah, basically, what about background?
There are universities in the United States that have programs for developmental editing, but primarily you will find that 99% of the schools only teach writing, and they only teach the sort of critical or creative writing aspects of writing. So going to that kind of education is really important and can be very helpful. It is not my background, though. Unfortunately, I did neither of those things. I studied psychology, and a deeper understanding of humans is actually the ultimate basis for writing. So it served me very well, but it is not what I went to school for. I started off working actually at Amazon.com for process improvement. I was in for lack of a better word, the math department, doing numbers and that kind of stuff. And I found out that they were opening a publishing division. And when I was a child, a little girl, I used to dream like the idea of, there's people who get paid and their only job is to read books, like had this wide-eyed idea that was the greatest thing that anybody could ever achieve, which of course, now that I do it, it's sort of not that glamorous, just as an aside, because it's a lot more just like fighting and arguing and feeling negative all the time about people's work, which is sad, but I ended up working in marketing for a long time. I loved that. I loved the act of deciding and helping figure out who would love this book and how do I help that person find it and read it and enjoy it as much as I have. But what I discovered along the way was that the biggest encumbrance to selling a book as a marketer was whether or not the book was worthy of being read in the first place, whether or not it was exciting and interesting or heartfelt or carried the right emotional weight or whatever, like had the things and the attributes that people were looking for. And so I became just sort of very opinionated about that and started working directly with writers. And actually, my very first client as a freelance editor was Blake Crouch. We met at a party, and I told him what I did not like about his story, which is really not the right way to talk to a writer, just as an aside. But he decided that I was right and asked me to work on all of his books after that. And so that's actually how I started a side career separate from my day job of just helping making books better. And then eventually the company that I worked for, asked me to come and be an editor for them because I had gained a reputation for doing this so well. So I was sort of at the right place at the right time, and unfortunately loud and unfortunately opinionated, but it worked out for me. I would say that there are in the US, and I don't know if there are in Georgia, there are guilds and unions that you can join that actually help you find jobs within the editing world and doing things like that, which are incredibly helpful. But the biggest way I would say for anybody who's thinking about becoming an editor or moving into this field is, it's all about, at least in the American publishing world, it's all about networking. It's all about going to New York and attending publishing parties and meeting people. That is the sort of the easiest way to kind of get going in that world. Yeah. Sorry, I know it's a little bit harder for people here to do, but that is sadly how I did it. Yeah.
Christina, what about you? What about our Georgian experience?
Well, I guess... can you hear me? Yeah, I think so. Well, first of all, thank you, Khatuna, and thank Writers House for such a wonderful opportunity. And Jackie, thank you so much for attending this and participating in this wonderful event. Well, Georgian experience is quite different, I guess, because as I mentioned when we talked previously, Georgian independent publishing is approximately 25, 30 years old. And of course, during Soviet times, there were publishing houses, they were structured differently, they were meant to publish differently, and sometimes the editors were also censors, not just editors. But of course, many things changed since then, and we have a different approach. But also, the interesting thing is that we don't have that guilt, and we envy a lot. And usually, when we recruit editors, they have the academic background, as you asked, what would be philology or literature, or something like that. But of course, it's very important that they should be also very good readers. Because, and what you talked about is very relevant. Of course, they should understand the structure of the text, the logic of the events going in the book or characters, and it's very important that the editor understands that. Unfortunately, we don't have any, I don't remember if we have in universities any of such kind of courses or faculties. But sometimes we try to find young editors, young philologists who could also step by step be trained in-house, and it's very helpful. Sometimes we also outsource, and sometimes it could be an editor, very experienced editor, who would be freelance or something like that. And also, in Soviet times, also I know, and I personally am very proud to know one of the editors who was behind the very serious Georgian classic authors, who helped them to structure the text better, and they're very well-known authors today, modern classics, so we can tell them that. And she was a brilliant editor. So some of our young editors could be where her, she unfortunately passed away several years ago, and some of our editors and translators worked with her, and it was a big, actually big advantage for us. But unfortunately, there are not many left.
Do you find, this is kind of maybe a weird question to ask, but for me, the best training for an editor is simply reading a lot of books, watching a lot of TV, watching a lot of film, and asking yourself over and over again, why was that good? Why did that work? Why is that applicable? And for me, as a child, I was sort of a fat and lazy kid, and I used to love to just lay around and watch TV all the time. And one could say, well, that was a wasted youth. But for me, I understand story structure from those kinds of experiences, like just from the actual training that, you know, your average person every day has. You may not realize it if you just take a step back and ask questions. You actually probably know much more about story than you realize. Is that something that you guys are finding when you're recruiting young people and talking to them, like that they have accidental training that might be useful?
Maybe I didn't think of that way, but of course it's very important that usually, as I myself see, I'm not an editor. Of course, when we started the publishing house, I was also an editor, layout designer, and distributor, and whatever. And also I copy edited books, etc. But myself now, of course, I'm not very much into editing. But when I had to work with young editors, also myself, I understand that every text has a logic. And you have to understand this, you know, when you are a good reader, it also means that you understand the logic. And it's, of course, based on the readings you've done and books you've read and movies you've watched. So it's very important. I didn't ask this particular question to myself, why it's that good, but it's a very good tip, I guess, and it would be very helpful. So thank you very much.
I wanted to ask about the boundaries, you know, between a text which needs heavy editing, really heavy editing, in order to be published, and how do you feel? How do you understand when you have something in front of you which has a really good literary potential, but needs a lot of work to be done? And when you have something which is just not suitable to go to the bookstores.
Well, there's a couple of different ways that I would think about that. I think the first thing that I always the first way I try to approach any novel that I think has merit but is definitely not ready is with like a lack of being in a hurry. You know, writers, especially younger aspiring writers, but even people who've been writing their whole life are often in such a rush to get their novel out and to have people reading it and to like get it in the store, and they're really excited to have their parents be able to like show it to somebody, and it gets really exciting from that perspective. But for me, you know, it's almost like baking, you know, like it's a science and it takes a lot of time, and you can't rush it because then your bread won't rise and your food won't turn out very well. So I have several authors that I've worked with who, when I first read the novel, I was like, well, the kernel of the idea of this is so, for lack of a better word, in the US we'd say sexy shit. It's like so amazing and great that you really want to get it out into the world, but that the book itself is probably garbage. And the idea in those situations is to start very slow. Say, okay, this will probably take 3 or 4 rounds with this author. The first round, I'm just going to say, here are the big plot and structure things that are not working. Now, you know, and explain it as nicely as possible, but not so nice that they don't understand that it's serious. And then send them off to work on that. And then when it comes back and you have it a little bit better, say, okay, now I need you to work on this part of the plot a little more, and these characters need more refinement. And by taking it in pieces, first of all, it doesn't overwhelm the writer, and second of all, you don't sort of lose the focus of what you're trying to do with them. You're trying to help them make their book as good as possible. You're not trying to overrule them and beat them into submission. So by giving it in edible pieces and giving it in chunks, and you can also help to refine the writing itself as you're doing that, because I do something that's called redlining, which is where I will just rewrite pages for you to show you how it should be. And by doing that in bits and pieces here and there, I find that as I'm getting it back the 3rd and 4th time, yeah, it does. It'll take, sometimes I edit books for 2 years. That's a real thing. You know, like, but as you're getting it back, the writing gets better, the plot gets better, the characters get better, the relationships get better. So that's typically how I would handle something that felt very overwhelming. However, when I worked more directly as a publisher, yeah, there were a lot of books that we would receive literally thousands of books a day. That's how the industry is in the US. And you would have to be incredibly ruthless about what you would publish and what you wouldn't, because there just aren't that many slots. You might publish 30 books and you've received probably 3,000 submissions. So if there was even like 2 or 3 sentences that I didn't like in the first 2 or 3 chapters, I would just reject it, which is horrible, because that poor writer has worked very hard on this book, and they have put a lot of time and effort and energy into it. But my feeling is that once you're sending it to an editor or to a publisher, you are saying this is as good as I can make it. And if the very best thing that you can do that you send to me has just bad writing or bad character or bad whatever right off the bat, then you have already told me that you are not good enough, which is like a sad thing to say out loud, but it is the reality, which is why I switched careers to doing developmental editing, because I really wanted to help these people who had obvious talent and merit get better, so that they could find a publisher who would then make it even better. And because, you know, you get another edit when you go into when you sell a book into publishing. And then it could go out and be sold and maybe made into a movie or a TV show, or maybe at least, you know, have something to give to people at Christmas. It's like, look what I did. So that's really the way I did it. Telling somebody that they are never going to be able to make it, which is another thing that does sometimes happen, is a much more heartbreaking thing. And usually when I would say that when those things happen, it comes down to a sentence by sentence ability to write. Because most people, you can work with somebody on character, you can work with somebody on plot, you can work with somebody on structure, but if you actually can't get out of your own way with the kinds of words that you use and how you use them, that's not something that anybody can help you with. So journaling, so for anybody out there who's running up against that kind of a problem, the best advice I can give you is to journal. It is to spend your time writing essays and letters and things like that to your friends and stuff. Just beginning to refine your own writing by writing constantly every day, even if it's not on the book you're planning on writing. because that act of continuously thinking about every word that you're using and why you're using it is the best way to improve your writing. And then sometimes those people have come back to me later where I said, no, you can't write, I'm sorry, which is, again, really sad and hard to say. And they have figured it out. So, I believe that a lot of people can write, whether or not you're disciplined and able to is a whole other story, right?
Thank you. I think so, yeah. I saw that, I've read, Hemingway once said, the first draft of everything is shit. So it is, you already say it is. So I wanted to ask you about, what do the writers think about this, and if they believe so now, and if it somehow, if it relates somehow to age, to the experience of writers also. Because I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I think that young writers think differently from the more experienced ones. And if the first draft is just garbage, how resistant are they? Because sometimes they are. You partly answered this question before, but it is very interesting because I know the translators are resistant. It's difficult to accept.
Can I ask you, as a translator,
yes.
would you find that your resistance to change is out of a desire to be faithful to the author and the original work, or is it because you actually think something is better?
No, actually, I listen to my, we call it, redactori, copy, editor, because we have some more revisor or something. Yes, I am happy as a translator if, more people read because I know that it can only improve. Then there are certain things which I don't accept. There are things I accept. But we have a good, at least in my case, I have a very good cooperation with them. Sometimes I am resistant when they say, well, this word doesn't exist, and we can invent words too. I mean, that's or sometimes they're very they fight against dialects and stuff, and some words which are not accepted in literal language, and I believe they need to be accepted. So those kind of things. But normally I'm very thankful to to editors, but I think it's harder for writers because the text when I translate, the text is not mine. So I have nothing with the plot and with the content, but I'm just the one who, translates and somehow transposes it in a different language and different culture. But so my role is limited. Nothing to say about that. But for the writers, it's different. I think at least they are more attached to their writing. They love it. They like it because they produce it, so they like it, and they are very resistant sometimes. They love it, exactly. So, so just to pass to the relationship between editor and author, and then I wanted to ask about you and Blake, how you cooperate. But let's just. Yes, and Tina, absolutely. Next is Tina to respond to this.
Well, there's quite a bit to unpack there. I would say that I think it depends on your perspective. How protective a writer can be, I find, has a lot more to do with whether or not the author considers what they're doing to be art, or if they consider what they're doing to be a commercial enterprise. Now, for me, I consider writing to be a form of communication, because that's literally what it is. But it is an attempt on the end of the writer to communicate something, whether it be emotionally or story-wise, with the world. So you sit alone for 2 years, and you are desperately trying to communicate at the end of those 2 years with the world something important that you have to say. And so for me, the best way for your message to get out is to say, well, let's talk about who's going to buy this book and why. And I know that sounds gauche and tacky, but I'm an American. We talk about money a lot, so it's a little less weird for me. But if you are wanting people to spend money or time reading your book, then you have to care about their experience and whether or not they will enjoy it. That is just the end of the day. And so that is often how I explain it to authors when I'm talking to them. Now, if you are writing a literary story, and when I say literary, I mean genre literary, not like literary, the term. I hope that that translates here. So like if you're writing something like that and you're hoping to win awards and you're not so much concerned about the money, then you're going to be much more attached to the concept of your art and all of that sort of stuff. But if you are writing a story because you really want a lot of people to read it, then it becomes a conversation about how do we refine that and how do we change it so that people will actually want to read it. For me, it is not uncommon. Let's just say a novel is 90,000 words. That's pretty common length in the US. It is not uncommon for me to say 40,000 of your words need to change at a bare minimum. That's not a weird conversation for me to have. And I think for any aspiring writer in the room, that should be your perspective. You're going to write your first draft, and it's probably going to be shit. Or worse. It just is. But the most important thing is that you wrote it, right? That you got that done, that you got the story out, that you got your characters mostly written out. Because if you are struggling with writer's block or the inability to write something, it's probably because you're trying to make it perfect the first time. And that is impossible, and it is a waste of time, and you are only hurting yourself and your career by having that perspective. But by instead saying, I'm going to write this shit, and I know it's going to be shit, and I'm going to be sad about it, and it's going to make me ill, but then when I'm done, I can at least look at it and evaluate it myself or have a loved one or a friend or somebody read it and tell me what needs to be done, then I can actually start to make progress. But the fallacy of the perfect writer who does everything on their own, it simply doesn't exist, especially if you are writing what we call big books, commercial fiction, things that a lot of people are going to read. Understand that those authors, in many cases, have 4 and 5 editors who are ripping the book from the very beginning and are actually working communally with those writers. And that is much more common than these people who hide away in a hole. You know, that's just, it's not the way art is done, it's not the way anything is done. We're doing it to communicate, and you need people to help you with that. So yeah, and as far as age goes, I would say that it goes both ways, right? Like, so a lot of times people who are older or a certain age, a lot of my clients are retired and are, you know, trying to start a second career in their free time. They oftentimes are much more open to changes and to other ideas because they have been through the ringer in their careers previously and have already learned that the best thing to do is listen to experts. But on the flip side, sometimes youth can also be a benefit because you're more willing to take chances, and you haven't been beaten down by the man yet, so you might also have a little more room in your, you know, I guess, mind to explore and to be more creative. So I find that it's either way can be good. I do think that younger people sometimes have a harder time editing because they're like, oh, well, I read a book that was published 100 years ago that did this and it was successful. And it's like, well, yeah, that was 100 years ago. Nobody writes like that today. And so sometimes that kind of conversation is a little bit harder with different age groups and different categories, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Tina, what about our writers?
Well,
how flexible are they?
It's an interesting question, but because all writers can be different, and also I think it's a very interesting point to point it out that in Georgian reality, because the market is very small, we don't have that many commercial literature writers. So mainly we as publishers also, we try to encourage them to write commercial, but it's like kind of a more literary fiction which are more acclaimed and you know, it's very sensitive. Sometimes, for instance, we had an experience that where there was a very interesting writer, Georgian writer, who wrote a thriller, a very good one, by the way. But and it was, well, back then it was in 90s or early 2000, and the infrastructure was so poor, no marketing, nothing. So the book didn't do well commercially, but neither any other books did back then. But we encouraged this writer to write another one because he did it very well before. And the next book he brought was literary fiction. It was not commercial anymore, and it was really bad. So, and it was like we understood that it's very, very different from American market. For UK market, it's very small, and more writers think it's, how to say, they are more, find it more challenging as well, but also they have this wish to write literary fiction, which is extremely difficult, and only few authors can do it really well. And as for the quote of Hemingway that every first draft is shit, well, I have a wonderful experience of reading a manuscript of one of our best Georgian contemporary authors, Tshkhadadze. It was his one of the first books, second book actually, and it was a manuscript written in very small print. And it was brilliant from the beginning. And he even, he just, I think we didn't even need to edit it. Really, it was so good. And also, my own experience was that he wanted to write another book. We have published 25 books by him, novels, and most of them award winners, etc. And one of the books, by the way, unfortunately, it's a very difficult novel because it's kind of a memorabilia inside, and it was very interesting structure, etc. And he told me that he wanted to write that novel and asked me to make him a kind of a residence. And he said, I cannot write it in Georgia because, many people contact me every day, journalists, etc., etc. So we decided to make a residence in Baku, Azerbaijan. Just in 2 weeks, he wrote that novel. And it was amazing. Also, as I told you, unfortunately, I don't have it in my hands, but it is really exciting. Mr. Dixley's Silent Box. It was a kind of a very interesting story. I don't want to spend more time about it, but really, I witnessed it. And I'm very happy to work on that particular book. It was an amazing experience. As for other writers, of course, some young writers have the same tendency. They love their books, they love their texts. It's very difficult to persuade them that it's not good. And it's also, sometimes, you try to work with the writer and tell them, well, I don't like this, let's change, and explain how it should be changed. And the next draft he brings, it's even worse sometimes. So it happens, and it's very difficult because it should be like, the editor and writer should have the very good understanding and collaborate very well to improve the text. And as I told you, we have many different experiences. Some writers are very very eager to collaborate and cooperate with editors. Sometimes they're very stubborn. Well, everything possible, every possible case could be. I think everywhere else this is the same.
Since we mentioned this, well, you talked about it, and Tina mentioned this cooperation between editor and author. So can I ask you about your collaboration with Blake? And how you work, and I don't know if you want to share the thing you are working now, just this period, and how it started. You said how it started, but how it works, because he edits his stuff for sure, and just himself, and then you work on that, or it just happens contemporarily, or how it works?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Blake will typically not tell me anything about what he's working on for the first, I would say, 30 to 40% of the novel. He will write it. And he doesn't even want to talk about it. He doesn't want me to know about it. He hides his journals because he does a bunch of, usually 2 or 3 months of research into whatever principle, scientific or, philosophical he wants to talk about. And he won't talk to me about it. And then he will, and then you'll see him like squirreling away and hiding things and being strange, and that's usually he's starting to write. And then at about 30 to 40% of the book, when he thinks it's there, that's when he sends it to me. And so then I start reading at that point. And at that time, because he still hasn't, Blake starts writing before he knows the ending of his novels. He only usually figures out the 25 to 30% of it when he starts, and then he starts working, and then sort of figuring it out as he goes. So it's very important not to, at that point, give notes about plot, really, because the plot is still forming. So more of the work is about where do I see the characters going, what do I think of the actual writing, is he capturing the things that he wants to capture? And then from that point on, it's sort of like the dam is broken. And so at any time of the day, whatever I'm doing, taking a shower, cooking dinner, taking the kids to something, who will pop up randomly while I'm in the middle of working on another book and be like, hey, what do you think about insert character name doing this instead of this? And I'll be like, I have no idea what the hell you're talking about, because I'm not thinking about it in that moment, and so then it becomes much more conversational, and now we're getting involved. And at that point, usually I start researching what he's working on. So like when he did recursion, it's about time and memory. So now I have to know about time and memory to edit the book. When he did dark matter, it's about quantum mechanics. So now I have to know about quantum mechanics to work on the book. When he did summer frost, it's about AI and superintelligence. So now I have to know about AI and superintelligence to work on the book. And that's not the case with just him. That's everyone. If somebody comes to me and they have a robotics book they want to work on, I have to read a lot about robotics so that I can work on the book. So that's usually when I start my research. We do a lot of talking, figuring things out. And then he'll send me the book when it's at about like 75% again. And then at that point I start redlining. So I start actually going in and being like, oh, you should have them say this instead of this. You should actually have them do this, But it's very light at that point because he's still figuring things out. It's very dangerous for anybody out there who wants to be an aspiring writer or editor. It's very dangerous who you let in at that point, because I could say one wrong word and then he'll throw the whole book out. That is a real thing that happens. So you kind of have to be very careful and about how you phrase things and how you talk about stuff. And this is not just the case with Blake. I have other authors who send me things as they're working as well. And it's very important that you are encouraging but also realistic, because if I see something I know has to change, then I'll call that out. But otherwise, more like being like, yeah, it's a great idea, keep writing, or this character needs some work, but not getting too deep into the weeds. And then at the point where he finishes the novel, we do another round of edits, and then he sends it to his New York editor, and that's his publishing editor. And then they, at that point, also give notes. And then he brings those notes back to me, we talk about them together, he makes more changes. Usually at that point, he again throws a whole bunch of the book away and writes some more. And then I do another round and he sends it back to New York again. And so this process is fairly excruciatingly painful for him, and less so for me. The scary time for me is earlier when he's just like, hey, should we have them run instead of walk? And I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. I was cooking dinner. So that's, usually the harder thing for me. But this process is really good for both of us. A lot of our stuff that we do is collaborative. We've worked on other kinds of writing like television and stuff together in the past. And that is also really beneficial for us in our relationship. It's the only reason it works, though, being married to a writer, is because we worked together for like 8 years prior to us having any kind of relationship of that level. And so because that foundation existed, that we have always worked together, it was a natural outcropping of our relationship. I will say one other thing too about editing that I meant to sort of mention earlier. The relationship between editor and author, at least the kind of editing that I do, is very, very personal. And oftentimes the author reveals to me more about themselves than they reveal about the subject that they're trying to write about. And so a lot of times what I'm encountering is that somebody is dealing with some trauma from their past or their childhood, or they are working through the emotional issues dealing with maybe having a child who has special needs or their wife dying or whatever. And a lot of times that is the subtext and it is the theme of the book, which you as the editor want to help bring out because that's what makes richness within fiction. But it is also really important that we respect that sort of relationship and that there is an understanding between us. Like, I will call my writers and say, Joe, I don't know if you know this, but you're talking about your son in this book. Are you actually okay about talking about your son in this book? And that is a big part of my process as well, because so much of writing is what's in your heart when you're writing it and what you're going through in that moment. So deciding to get divorced or dealing with the fact that you're secretly having an affair or all this other stuff, you will accidentally tell me in your book as I'm reading it because it's the first or second draft and everything is laid bare emotionally on the page. And how you help somebody with that and cultivate that or help them suppress it if it's something they don't want people to know about is also a big part of like the editing process.
I just agree with that because it's very, very important. You don't just need to work on the text, but you have to see the author behind it. And I have, from my personal experience, I have to just say, agree with you, because I had a year ago, I had a very interesting case when a young Georgian writer sent me her manuscript, and we published her regularly, and it was her new novel. And she had a very, painful separation from her partner just before she finished her novel. And I knew about it, and also I felt about it in her text, and it was novel was very good. And actually, I didn't want. I could publish it immediately, but then I understood that she put herself so much in the text, in the novel, that I advised her, please, let's wait a little bit, because it's very fresh and very personal. And I think it would be very painful for you after a while when you will understand that so many people got your story and got into yourself, into your mind, and it was so much. It was a good novel, really good novel, but I resisted. I had a very...
Well, especially if she has children who might read the book later, or if she meets another partner. Or another question that I often think about is like, what if you get criticism about this thing? What if you're writing about your dead mom or something, and somebody says something terrible about this book? My goodness, that's really smart. It could be
very painful afterwards. And she said yes. I'm very happy that she agreed. Maybe after a while she will rewrite or rethink about. And I would love to publish that novel, but it was very, very personal. So that's very good that you brought out that point.
Okay, I wanted to ask you, I know that you you cooperate with publishing houses, and you work also with self-published authors too. We have a lot of them here in Georgia. Well, they often are not taken, very, there is a lot of skepticism about them. But I wanted to ask you if there is any substantial difference in your job, in terms of job of editor, according to this aspect,
Yeah, so about a third of my clients are like, for lack of a better word, best-selling writers in the United States who do very well, and we work together similar to how Blake and I do, because I have helped make them successful in the past. They want to keep working with me, and maybe some superstition plays into that. And then probably another 30 to 40% of them are writers who have publishing contracts, who have deals, who have other editors that they work with as well, who maybe just come to me because they want to make this book better, or because they're stuck on the third book in a series and they're not really sure where to take it, or whatever. They kind of just need some extra help, but they are otherwise, working within publishing. And then the rest of them are either first-time writers or self-published writers. These are people who are either looking to get an agent, which I know is different in the U.S. than it is here, or a publishing house interested, and they either have never been published before, or the other option is that they're self-publishing this novel and that they make a living off of self-publishing, and this is part of their livelihood, and they want me to help make sure that book is as good as possible. And so that's long-winded, I apologize. But when I'm working with a self-published author, it is very different, because I'm actually probably harder on those books. Like if I were, say, working on a fantasy novel with an author who intended to go out and try to get an agent after this and then sell it into a big publisher and get a bunch of money or whatever from somebody, I'm more or less looking at technicalities. Like, technically, is this the correct structure? Technically, have you done your characters correctly? Is this the way that people who are looking in the industry would want a book to be? And I'm not refining it too far down, because the next person who buys the book and is going to publish it is also going to have opinions, and they're going to say, oh, I want this to be brought forward, or I want this, that, or the other. There's actually a really famous story about Harper Lee, who wrote To Kill a Mockingbird, and I don't know if that has translated very well over here, but it's a massive book in the U.S., very important cultural touchstone. And the original book of that, there was one chapter for which her developmental editor said, just this chapter is good, the rest of this book is garbage.
what is important when you read your lovely book and writing about them. Is it interesting for readers?
Yeah. Yeah. A little. So there's just like one chapter that the editor said you need to make this into the whole book, and that's sort of like one of the more famous stories of this kind of stuff. But so with a self-published author, it's very different because I know that this is the final product that they want somebody else to read. So at that point, my goal is to make it as close to what they want the book to be as possible, because you're your own boss when you're in self-publishing. So it's really your vision of the novel. So if you are saying, I want this to be a fun mystery set in 1800s and I want it to work on that level, I'm not concerned about whether or not somebody else in publishing is going to want to buy it or work on it or anything else, or leaving room for making that other editor one day happy who's going to acquire it. My only concern is making this book as good as possible. So oftentimes I'm much harder on those books, and I edit them for much longer because it is the final product. Nobody else is ever going to look at it or touch it or talk about it, so a lot more responsibility falls on me. There are a lot of American authors who are completely self-published, who love the freedom. They love that they get to choose all their covers and every word in the book is theirs. And you know, in the US, if you want, for example, to be like a big commercial author and have TV shows and movies and stuff like that, you pretty much have to go through traditional publishing. But if you just love to write and you love to tell stories, you can find an audience through self-publishing, and a lot of those authors are very happy with that as part of their career. So the job for me is a little different in that scenario because of that.
Yeah, thank you. Have you ever discarded a book which was then published by someone else with success or great success? It's kind of, yeah, it can happen.
Yeah, I won't say the name, but there was a novel. This is actually a funny story because it is also sort of giving myself a compliment, so, you know, because I have to do that whenever I can. So there was a novel that came to me that was half told in current time and half told in, like, you know, pre-World War I, you know, America, and it was the juxtaposition of those two, and it was back and forth each chapter, and I was like, you know, this is just not working for me. The more interesting story is the one that entirely takes place in the past, and you don't need to deal with any of this current time stuff. And I was like, no, and I rejected the book, and then like 2 years later, it came out, and it was this massive, huge, million-copy best-selling book in the United States. And I was like, no, like, you know, you sort of die inside. You're like, I'm a failure. I've missed this book. But then it turned out I read it, and they'd taken my advice. They'd done entirely the historical thing. They got rid of all the modern stuff. And I was like, oh, well, wish you would have brought it back to me, because I would have loved to have published that multi-million copy selling. It's coming out as a movie next year, like crazy book. But also I was sort of glad. I was like, okay, good, I wasn't wrong, you know, because that's always a scary thing. But, you know, you can pass on stuff all the time. I work with a lot of bigger named authors who have things that you guys have probably heard of that I've said, oh, I think that's terrible. It's terrible, you know, and they persevere with it anyways, and then it turns out to be a huge, massive project. So, you know, you're not always right. Like, the author really has to, at the end of the day, it's your name on the book. So you have to believe in the edits that are being made and look for good advice. And that is probably one of the hardest things about being a writer, is knowing when somebody is right about your novel and when somebody is wrong. Because sometimes they are. I can be wrong. Anyone can be wrong. It's all about that discernment. And that is a quality of writing 5 and 6 books. So I would always encourage anybody who has written 1 or 2 books and they were rejected, and, you know, that's sort of like that heartbreaking feeling. Keep writing, because a lot of times it takes the 3rd or the 4th thing that you've done to understand not only how to write, but also how to edit, which is such a huge, ask any writer, it's a huge part of the process. It's very important.
Tina, I don't know if you want to comment on that, or you prefer not to.
Well, I'm thinking now. Actually, myself, I have never rejected that book, but it was our acquisition editor who did. To be honest, usually when I read a manuscript, I know mainly from the very first sentence whether this is our book or not, because we have our own priorities. We are in the publishing already for I myself maybe for more than 30 years or something like that. Sorry, I don't remember exactly, but something like that. And so I have this feeling when I read the first sentence, in most of the cases, I already know whether this book is we have to publish it or not. Sometimes I have recently received a manuscript from a writer who published his first book somewhere else. And now this is the first time when I'm very doubtful, because I have this mixed feelings about this text, I think there are some very nice moments. I'm very doubtful he has to rewrite or redo it. At the same time, I'm thinking, is it our book or not? This is the first time ever I thought about it. It's very interesting process, actually. And also, as for rejecting, yes, we had this case, but then I said yes, and that book won also some prize, etc. later, and I was like, it would be nice if we should publish. But then I thought, when I read it, well, it was not actually our book, so I was not that. Well, we don't have that kind of competition as in the US. I know how tense it could be, and and when there is a small market, actually, it doesn't really. Of course, it's tense between the publishers. We also sometimes have this kind of, competition when we want to acquire author, etc., but it's not as in big markets.
Do you find ever that you are initially not interested in a book, but then you hear about how, like in translation, how successful maybe it was in other countries, and then that gets in your head, like, well, maybe I'm wrong. Does that ever kind of happen or do you not really take into consideration how successful a book is somewhere else?
Usually we do, because it's when you have, we don't have that many manuscripts coming to our publishing house, so actually I read most of them myself. As for translation, yes, we have to look after how successful the book is in other markets. It's very, very important, because if the book is very successful in other markets, most probably it would be successful in Georgia. Of course, it's not always the case, because sometimes it could be different, but it's one of the criteria of choosing the translated fiction.
I wanted to ask you, are there any literary discoveries you're particularly proud of? I don't know if you want to share the names or titles with us, or any authors you love to collaborate with. I don't know.
This is kind of a hard one to answer, because a lot of my work, especially as a freelance editor, is about working with authors in a manner where I don't actually talk about their names, and they can choose to acknowledge that they work with me, but I don't necessarily acknowledge I work with them. But I would say, or I shouldn't, but Blake and I actually did a story collection a number of years ago called the Forward Collection, and we chose the authors that we wanted to invite to be a part of the collection and we chose the prompt together. And I don't know how famous some of these authors are here, but we got some pretty big named American authors, and that's probably the thing that I'm the most proud of, because it was such a wide variety of people. So Veronica Roth, who did the Divergent series, we had Andy Weir, who did The Martian. We had Paul Tremblay, who did my favorite book maybe of the last 25 years, Head Full of Ghosts. We also did, Blake obviously wrote a story for it. N.K. Jemisin, who did the 5th season. She's huge in the United States. And I'm forgetting somebody, I feel like. But there's always somebody. But that's probably one of the proudest things that I've worked on, because it was an opportunity to reach out to authors that I loved, who I personally admired, and say, hey, this kind of story for us, and they agreed to it, and then they let me edit it. Oh, Amor Tolles is the other one who did Gentleman in Moscow, which was a huge book in the US as well. And like actually work with some people who would never normally probably hire me because they're so established and they have their own careers, but who were also, I got to learn a lot from them and experience that with them. And several of those stories have gone on and been sold into other countries and been translated. And so that's probably one of the things that I'm the most proud of. I would say this author isn't known here at all, but I have an author that I discovered in the US named Joe Hart, who I worked with on quite a few books. And he's just one of those people who, even if he never becomes like a big name, he's just such a talented writer, and having that opportunity just to like see raw work and work directly with it, like nothing is better than that. I have so many authors that I love that I work with who are very talented and great, but like every once in a while you find something that is just like, oh my God, I wish everyone could read this because it's so freaking good. And I don't think that many people get to have that experience that often, but I'm glad that for the times that I have had it, yeah.
Thank you very much. I wanted also just a very banal question. What do you like most of about your job, and what you like least? If that's not a very stupid question.
No, it's not a stupid question. It's going to be very revealing about me. I'm kind of like, for lack of a better word, a critical asshole. I just am that person who like sees everything and I think, oh, it could be better. Not this room. This room is beautiful. But you know what I mean? Like anything can be better. And it's really gratifying to have a job where somebody will actually pay you to like say to them, like, I think you should do these words this way, and like have your opinion be validated. I mean, it's really, probably loud and American of me, but like that is really what I love about my job, is that I get carte blanche to say what I mean to people and they pay me for it. It's shocking. The other thing I would say about my job is, reading for pleasure is always still about me dissecting everything, but getting the opportunity to really analyze, like, why does George R.R. Martin, why is he so much more successful than this fantasy novelist? And like actually having my job be to figure out why. That is really cool. It's like being a detective all day. And I love that. I love that aspect of it. I am massively dyslexic, so I have to read every single word, whereas most people read sentences, right? I have to read every word, and it actually makes me uniquely good at my job, which is something I want to say to the people who are here. If you're thinking about a career in publishing or writing or whatever, being different is an asset within that community, in any arts, but especially in the world where, because I have to read very specifically, I actually understand every single word you've written, and I can tell you sentences that don't work that other people would have just read, and like let go, especially within dialogue. And so turning your, not deficits, I would say, but things that are traditionally not known to be things that you would be good at into your asset is a really wonderful thing. And there's so much room for that in the publishing world just in general. So, yeah.
I wanted it's just a quick question. What about nonfiction? You have some experience about nonfiction too. Do you like doing that? And if there are, differences, big differences in editing, in the process of editing between nonfiction and fiction.
So I don't do scholarly nonfiction. So like if you were to be like, or not just scholarly, but also like, or things like, here's a manual for how to build a robot. I'm not your girl. Like, I don't know how to do that kind of writing. But I really love nonfiction essay writing, and I think that the biggest thing, and the only advice I can give to anybody who is doing that kind of work of like the nonfiction shorter form where you're actually saying something about a topic that's important to you, sort of the best advice I can give about that is that weirdly, that's the most important thing is voice, as opposed to in fiction, which you would think it's the other way around. We often conflate the two. Like having a lot of voice within a novel is actually kind of can be something of a negative thing. Your characters should have voices. You as the writer should be enveloping people in a world, right? But an essay is really an opportunity to talk about something using your unique voice and your unique characteristics. So oftentimes when I'm working on stuff like that, I'm actually asking people to give me more of themselves. And usually the mistake is that you take so much of yourself away. The other thing I would say too about nonfiction writing, or fiction writing for this matter, is become an expert in what you're writing about. like the old cliche is like write what you know, which I hate because like we all kind of know the same sorts of things, right? Like writing about being a writer is the dullest thing in the world. But if you can become an expert about like the type of characters that you're creating and really understand them, that oftentimes is the reason people can't write, is that they are not experted enough in something. So if you're finding that you're stuck either in nonfiction or in fiction, and you're writing about, say, a scientist who falls in love, you know, over, you know, finding the cure for COVID, you might not know enough about those subjects, and there's nothing wrong with that, but you should become an expert in that. And that is, you know, across the board, probably the biggest reason why people either have inauthentic writing or have trouble writing, is that they haven't actually done the work to understand what they're writing about in the first place well enough. I don't know if I answered your question at all. I was all over the place, yeah.
Because I wanted to, do we have time for questions and answers? I wanted just to, yeah,
I talked too much, I'm sorry,
the end, but I have another, just let me, I found this, Max Perkins, who was one of the greatest editors and who is known for discovering Hemingway, Fitzgerald, as I remember, and Thomas Wolfe. He said, this is a quote, "An editor adds nothing to a book. At the most, it releases energy. The best work of a writer comes entirely from himself." Well, he said himself, we add him and herself.
Yeah.
So what do you think about it? And I mean, what is the core thing which enables editor to release that energy?
I think it's trust. I think you have to like develop a rapport with your writer, and I think that they have to know that more than anything in the world, you love them in their book. And I do mean love. You know, it has to come from that sense of passion and that sense of belonging. I will also say that Max Perkins is really doing himself a disservice in that quote. A couple years ago, I think it wasn't Hemingway, was it Fitzgerald? Their family released the original manuscripts before Max had edited them, and they were absolute garbage. So, like, you know, there is something important there about the idea of, like, when you're so in your own head as a writer, you actually need somebody else to come in and say, yes, you're doing a good job, but this could be better. But I also think that a lot of it really has to come from the belief that the writer has that you actually want the best thing for them and their story. And if you don't have that rapport, you get people not trusting your advice and trusting your feedback and not wanting to do what you want them to do. And so that's usually at the heart, I think, for me, of most pushback on editing, is that if we don't actually care about each other, then we will never be able to work together that way. Yeah.
Great. I want to ask the audience also, if you have questions, please. თუ გაქვთ კითხვები ხო, შეგიძლიათ, არ ვიცი, ამასობაში, იმიტომ რომ ჩვენ მივდივართ, მე მგონი დასასრულისკენ, თუ სწორად ვიცით რო, ხო? ასე რომ შეგიძლიათ. Just feel free to ask. Are there any aspiring writers? Could ვინმე სხვა რა აქვს? არ ვიცი. დიახ, გისმენთ.
როგორ შეიძლება შენი საყვარელი ნაწარმოები აქციო შენს კიდევ ერთ-ერთ პუბლიცისტურ ნაწარმოებად, რომელიც მე მკითხოს დააინტერესდება, ანუ გააკეთო გარკვეული პერიფრაზივით, შინაარსის ფრაზები, გამონათქვამები, შინაარსი შეკრიბო და ეს შემდეგ რამდენად ღირებული იქნება მკითხველისათვის, თუ გამოსცემ შენს პროზაული კრებული იქნება ეს, თუ რაიმე ფორმის ან შინაარსის თვალსაზრისით რაიმე წიგნი ან კრებული ან გამოცემა რაიმე, თუნდაც ჟურნალი, გაზეთი.
I would say for anybody who is trying to make a book better that you've been working on, or a novel or a story or anything like that, really it is an act of studying what it has been successful that is similar to what you're doing. Writing is really just pattern recognition. So why did this work? Not copying, I don't mean that, but like the idea of you are looking for why some other things were successful, and then look at your novel and say, does it have those attributes, and how can I acquire those attributes, and how can I add them? That would be my advice.
მოგესალმებით პირველ რიგში მინდა ძალიან დიდი მადლობა გადაგიხადოთ ძალიან საინტერესო დისკუსიისთვის საქართველოში ხშირად არ იმართება საუბრები ამ თემაზე და ძალიან საინტერესო იყო ნამდვილად თქვენ იმდენი რაღაც ჩამოთვალეთ ჩემს თვალში თქვენ მარტო რედაქტორი კი არა ღმერთი ხართ მწერლისთვის იმ მეგობარი კრიტიკოსი ფსიქოლოგი ყველაფერი ეს ძალიან დიდი ფუფუნებაა ნებისმიერი ავტორისთვის არ ვიცი ჩვენთან მე მგონი აი ამ ფუნქციებს რაც თქვენ ჩამოთვალეთ რამდენადაც მე ძალიან კარგად ახლოს არ ვიცნობ საგამომცემლო მუშაობას საქმიანობას მაგრამ მე ესეთი შთაბეჭდება მრჩება რომ ფუნქციების დიდი ნაწილი თვითონ გამომცემლები აკეთებენ ამას და ჩვენთან რედაქტორები უფრო ტექსტზე მუშაობენ ასე მგონია მე ძალიან დიდი ხანია წლებია ვმუშაობ როგორც რედაქტორი ოღონდ არ ვმუშაობ მხატვრულ ტექსტებზე მე მაქვს ესეთი და ამისი მიზეზი არის ის რომ ვერასოდეს ვერ ვიღებ პასუხს ვერც ჩემ თავთან და ვერც ავტორთან იმიტომ რომ ასე მგონია რომ საქართველოში შეიძლება სხვაგანაც ძალიან ფაქიზია მიდგომა ძალიან ტკივნეულია ტკივნეულად აღიქვამენ ავტორები მათ ტექსტში ჩარევად აღიქვამენ იმას რაზეც თქვენ საუბრობდით იმ ტექსტებზე რომელზეც მე წლებია ვმუშაობ, იქ ძალიან ადვილია მუშაობა. ის არ არის მხატვრული ტექსტები და მე ვიცი სადამდე უნდა წავიდე, ბოლომდე უნდა წავიდე, იმისთვის რომ ქართულ ენაზე ტექსტი იკითხებოდეს და გასაგები იყოს. მხატვრულ ტექსტებთან ჩვენთან ცოტა სხვანაირად არის. ხათუნამ დასვა კიდეც საზღვრის საკითხი. უბრალოდ ძალიან დიდი მადლობა მინდა გადაგიხადოთ სამივე მომხსენებელს, ძალიან საინტერესო იყო.
You're welcome.
So I have a question about research. Obviously, you have to do a lot of research for science fiction and every other kind of book, but I'm interested in fantasy specifically. What kind of research would you do for fantasy? Obviously, you have to come up with a lot of concepts by yourself for that. So what would your advice be in that case? That's my question.
So with fantasy, there's probably 3 or 4 different kinds of research that you can do. The biggest one, of course, is what kind of mythology do you want to be pulling from? If you're doing the standard Western mythologies, do you understand, how historically dragons work or how magic works? And then the research that you would be doing is, how do I make that different? How do I expand upon it? But the bigger aspect of fantasy and the most important piece of research that anyone can do has to do actually with world building. I don't know if that's a common term that you guys use around here, but N.K. Jemisin, who is the writer I was talking about earlier, she does a really fantastic podcast about this, and I would highly recommend looking it up. But it has to do with the kind of research that you do in fantasy that, let's just say you're trying to make a world. Okay, where is your main city set in? Does it take place in a city? Okay, what is the economic backbone of that city? How did that city get formed? What is the history of that city? And then your research, you will find, actually has more to do with how cities are created in the first place, and why people settle in certain areas, and why do they migrate, and what kind of crops are grown there, and why is that important economically to the lifespan of the people who live there. And so what ends up happening is that your research is a little less about what you would think it would be about, which is what kind of magic are we going to use? And it ends up being a lot more about how a world is crafted so that it is believable. And believability of a world, believe it or not, is the most important thing in fantasy, because it's not like Tolkien's world makes sense because everything about how it's laid out and the races and all that stuff is very interconnected. And the only way to do that is to historically understand how sociologically that stuff happens anyways. So a lot of times that's the kind of research that I'm doing too, is like something about this place doesn't seem right. You know, you wouldn't colonize the moon this way. So then you have to understand how to colonize it. Not just how would somebody go about scientifically colonizing the moon, but how did colonies historically happen? And what was their function? And how did we expand, you know, as a people into different territories and places? And then using that same logic on the moon, which now you have to understand scientifically the moon. Does that make sense? I feel like I'm rambling here, but yeah, okay.
Jackie, thank you so much. And
thank you guys so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for being today with us and for sharing your experience, which is really exciting. And we hope to meet you again in Tbilisi. I know that you leave tonight. And, well,
I'm here tomorrow. I teach tomorrow, too, in the morning. It's
tomorrow,
or midday.
And thank everyone for being here. And, well, thank you, Tina. Thank you very much.